Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Welcome to the EVN Anthology release event on De-siloing Existential Threats. My name is Kim Oberkthal, and I manage the Inclusive International Security Program here at BASIC and coordinate our Emerging Voices Network. We're joined today by a fantastic group of people who will be presenting their policy paper shortly. It's a pleasure to have you joining us today. And to conclude this EVN policy cycle. But before we get to hear from our fantastic keynote speaker, Vincent Ntondi, and our brilliant working group chairs, I would like to just briefly give you a bit of background on our Emerging Voices Network in case you're not yet familiar with it. So the EVN is a digital and global network of high potential early career researchers on nuclear weapons and nuclear policy issues. Through the EVN, we also seek to engage and platform early career and young professionals, especially from communities and countries that are underrepresented in mainstream nuclear policy fora. And our network is very committed to helping these individuals overcome institutional barriers to ensure that nuclear fora become truly global and also include perspectives of communities that may often be minoritized or have been impacted by nuclear weapons development. So with diversity and inclusivity at the forefront, we work with young and next generation leaders from the global north and south to highlight young and early career perspectives on nuclear policy. So with this in mind, and with the support of the Ploughshares Fund, 5 working groups consisting of early career nuclear experts from around the world completed research on de-siloing existential threats, challenging identity power and inclusivity in the nuclear policy field. And this policy cycle was dedicated specifically to breaking down silos and challenging ideas and approaches within, but also adjacent to the nuclear policy field. As is written in the introduction of our anthology, issues relating to identity power and inclusivity inform international security practices, nuclear policy and peace building in many ways, especially as they can have significant implications for individual societies and states all over the world. And with that in mind, 5 EVN working groups, each led by 2 co-chairs, set out in January 2023 to research and draft a policy paper, each and a set of policy recommendations for the international community to consider and take forward. Now, the working groups engaged with and confronted key issues relating to examining and dismantling the military-industrial complex, nuclear weapons issues and climate change, increasing equity, diversity, and inclusivity in the nuclear weapons policy field and within the community of practitioners, challenging racism and white supremacy in nuclear weapons policymaking, and nuclear weapons issues and social justice. Now, 6 months later, we just published the resulting anthology report on our website last week, and you can also find the link in the chat, which we'll put there shortly. The report is very much the result of hard work, dedication, and true teamwork from these 5 groups of young professionals that have all come up with fantastic papers and really noteworthy recommendations, and really hope that those in our audience will take these and consider those and share those with those that can effect the most change. But before we get to hear from those groups about these key takeaways, I would really like to introduce our fantastic keynote speaker, Professor Vincent Ntondi, who we are lucky to have and who are lucky to welcome back to an EVN event. Vincent Ntondi is a professor of history and founder of the Institute for Race, Justice, and Civic Engagement at Montgomery College in Tacoma Park, Maryland, which he directed from 2018 to 2023. From 2009 to 2017, he was Director of Research for American University's Nuclear Studies Institute in Washington, D.C. And he regularly works with organizations exploring ways to include more diverse voices in the nuclear disarmament movement, with his research being focused on the intersection of race and nuclear weapons. Today, he will be addressing in more detail the need to de-silo existential threats and why it is so essential to highlight these topics in today's nuclear policy discourse. So Vincent, thank you so much for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I got a chance, obviously, to really dive in and look at all the work that you guys have done and put in. And I want to thank you, because the work that you guys did just shows what an amazing group of scholars that you truly are. Leonardo da Vinci, Steve Jobs, Albert Einstein. What did they all have in common? Well, besides being geniuses, they also loved art, and they loved science, and they loved history, and they loved music and poetry and physics and chemistry and engineering. We're all talking about Oppenheimer right now because of the new movie coming out. And he's nicknamed the father of the bomb. But Oppenheimer also loved to read fiction. He absolutely loved poetry. Some would call it his first love. And so we do such a disservice when we tell students at such an early age that they must choose a path. And then this becomes their identity. We force them into a box. We force them into a category. Only study what will get you money. Only study what will get you a job, not what you're most passionate about. And what if you're a student and you're passionate about multiple things, right? We want to silo individuals. We want to silo subjects. If you study STEM, you can't dip into humanities, which makes absolutely no sense. And we do this with historical figures. When I wrote African Americans Against the Bomb, people said I was crazy, that no one in the Black community cared about nuclear disarmament. We take these names like Dr. King and Rosa Parks and others, and we want to put them in their neat categorical little boxes. We actually do that in textbooks. With Dr. King, we want to preserve him on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial with I Have a Dream, as if that encompasses his entire life. And none of us is one thing, right? And you know that, you've shown that. We can no longer do this. Lorraine Hansberry, known for A Raisin in the Sun. Yes, she was a writer, but she was also a socialist, a feminist, and yes, vehemently against nuclear weapons. And so you have not only shown why it's important to de-silo this issue and how it relates to race and climate change and militarism and gender, but you have shown why it's so urgent. And that is long overdue. And so that's why I thank you so much. When we look at the relationship between climate change and nuclear disarmament, why is it a competition? It shouldn't be. It's a competition now of which one is worse. The reality is that both are existential threats to the world. One can happen in a matter of minutes. One is going to take a little bit longer. But here we are in this industry competing for money and jobs and attention and clicks. But the commonality, the thing that we have in common with the climate change movement and the nuclear disarmament movement is, I would think we all love and care deeply about this planet and humanity. And so if we are collectively trying to save it from annihilation, then we should be working together, as you have shown. When it comes to the military-industrial complex, what do we see? They are the biggest polluters in this world when it comes to climate change. They are spending so much money on nuclear weapons that could go to other people. When we see people are starving in this world, when we see people that are going to be dying from heat stroke or in the winter have no heat, these issues are not separate in any way. And I think most importantly is when we turn to the issue of DEI and gender equity. But what I got from all of your work, whether you intended to do this or not, I don't know, is the real issue is, are we and are you reformers or revolutionaries? That's really what it comes down to. Reform is good. Obamacare is reform. National health care in the United States is revolutionary. Now, Obamacare saved millions of lives. It helped millions of people. It's significant and it matters. Recycling and driving an electric car, those are great reforms to help the environment. A Green New Deal is revolutionary. Arms control treaties, they have kept us alive. There have been incremental steps. and they are great reforms. But complete and total disarmament, a treaty that bans nuclear weapons 100%, those are revolutionary acts. And this is no different with DEI. We are seeing now offices of DEI being created all over the place. We give out a grant here or there. We hire one fellow who happens to be from the global South. We have talks and conferences about racism in the nuclear policy field and reforms we can do. And those are all good. They are needed, but they are not revolutionary. And what you guys have done, the recommendations that you have put forth throughout this entire document, are revolutionary if they are actually followed through. Creating funding for students from the global South, students of color in impoverished and marginalized areas, so that they have the opportunity to learn about nuclear disarmament, have the means to study it in higher education, have the means to travel to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, know what places like the Middlebury Institute for International Studies or Harvard or Princeton even are and are attainable. That would be revolutionary. Creating lesson plans and providing educational tools for teachers of all ages, for all subjects, regardless of your race, regardless of where you live, regardless of your economic status, to learn about nuclear weapons, that's revolutionary. Fixing the visa process, so those like Daniel who did work on part of this project, and others have the opportunity to study wherever they want and have the ability to educate and inspire others and are not shut out because of their country of origin, is revolutionary. Seeing nuclear disarmament and arms control organizations finally led by colonized peoples, peoples who have shared experience, lived experiences, to see a movement indigenously led, those that have is the most at stake, that would be revolutionary. When I read and studied what you had written about gender, we all know the amazing work of those like Ray Atchison, Reaching Critical Will, WCAS, amazing individuals. But they would be the first to tell you that they stand on the shoulders of giants, that women, that people of color, that the LGBTQ community have been leaders in this movement since 1945. In 1982 in the United States, we had the largest single rally of any kind in Central Park for nuclear disarmament. That was led by the LGBTQ community, by women, people like Leslie Kagan and Helen Caldicott and Randy Forsberg, Kathy Engel. 50% of the leadership that day was African American. These voices have always been there, they've just been ignored. And so having a young student of color be able to see themselves in this history, see themselves in the current struggle for nuclear disarmament, that's revolutionary. So we can and we must push for reforms through voting, lobbying, supporting arms control and disarmament organizations. And these measures will hopefully incrementally change the narrative and save ourselves. But as we inch through reform, I don't ever want you to lose sight on what the ultimate goal is: complete nuclear disarmament and racial equality. And for that to happen, I implore every one of you to commit to the work that you are doing. Commit to the work that you have done so brilliantly in this report and become revolutionaries. If not now, then when? I am so proud of all of you. I thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to hearing all your reports, answering any questions. And I hope as we move forward, we can really have a revolution to make sure that future generations can live without the fear of dying from nuclear war. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vincent. Thank you for highlighting just how essential addressing these challenges and becoming maybe potentially a bit revolutionary when it comes to these. I think this was a really fantastic opening, and I think it's the great introduction that we need to kick off the following presentation. So thank you for that. Now moving on to our working group presentations. We will hear from each group first, and then we'll have a brief Q&A part directly following their presentation. So please do use the Q&A function to submit any questions you have or that you would like the presenters to address. And also just a final note to please keep in mind that our EVN leads speak in their personal capacity today as a member of the Emerging Voices Network. So first we'll hear from the co-chairs Orion Oda and Vivienne Zhang, who together with the working group drafted a paper on the supporting role of the military-industrial complex to nuclear weapons, a case study on the United Nations and the United States from cultural, political, and economic perspectives. To briefly introduce them, Dr. Orion Oda is a lecturer in international relations at FECAP in Brazil. He received his PhD in international relations from King's College London and the University of Sao Paulo. And he also holds an MA in international security from the University of Groningen and a BA in international relations from the Pontifical Catholic University of Minas Gerais. His research focuses on symbolic aspects of nuclear weapons and the role of status and prestige in nuclear politics. Vivienne Zhang is a consultant for the Weapons of Mass Destruction program at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. She's also a Reducing Nuclear Weapons Risks Fellow at the Council on Strategic Risks. And previously, she worked at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada and various Canadian missions abroad in Europe and Asia. She holds a master's degree in international security from Sciences Po Paris and a bachelor's degree in modern European studies from the University of British Columbia. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining, and we look forward to hearing the comments on your paper. So over to the two of you. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Kim. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm still digesting a little bit of Vincent's keynote speech, so it was great. Well, so in our paper, Vivian and I, we analyzed the pervasive relationship between the United States and the military-industrial complex, the MIC. And we found that the MIC's interests in the US and beyond are put before the public's general interest due to its influence over the political, economic, and cultural spheres. The direst issues are related to transparency and what we call the revolving door effect. We reach our conclusions by analyzing how the nuclear MIC influences US policy through narratives rooted in Cold War era thinking and values. To give a little bit of context, even during the Cold War, Eisenhower issued a clear warning regarding the significant amounts of power ceded to the MIC and its influence on US government. The MIC, focusing on its own interests and agenda, pushed a narrative of a state of perpetual war in which an ever-growing military was an imperative for state survival. In the Cold War, there was little convincing needed for these narratives. However, after the end of the Cold War, in a place and time where the state of alarmness of nuclear weapons was expected to diminish, the influence that the MIC had on US decision-making did not waver. The MIC had already constructed a solid narrative of military and nuclear dominance, which was now etched in US identity. Issues of nuclear policy were kept hidden from the public arena, which maintained the inflated military status quo, despite recent surveys pointing to a decrease in public support for nuclear weapons, especially amongst the youth. Public support for nuclear disarmament pushes back against a depiction of disarmament as a quote-unquote utopian fantasy. The severe diversion of US positions from public preferences indicate how the MIC and its vested interests compromise democracy and democratic values. Furthermore, we highlight how the relationship between the MIC and government create what we call a revolving door effect, in which the same individuals occupy positions among decision-making in the government and the MIC. Policymakers and senior military officials often collaborate with lobbyists, defense industry executives, and legislators to promote overkill-capable weapons, while they rotate between these high government and industry positions. As a result, these individuals often have conflicts of interest which can undermine the integrity, transparency, and effectiveness of decision-making processes. Now, Vivienne will walk us through the main issues and the main impacts of the MIC in the economic side, as well as present our major recommendations. Thank you. Vivian?
Thank you very much, Orion, and I apologize to everyone in advance that I have some unexpected Wi-Fi issues, so I will stay just on audio. So as Orion mentioned, he covered some more cultural and political aspects focused on policy narratives as well as framing, and I will go into more detail now about the economic side. So the context that we looked at includes nuclear weapons accounting, the lobby, as well as some risks within the defense industry. So first, to begin with, on the accounting, American nuclear weapons are not only very expensive, it's also almost impossible to account for the nuclear arsenal. So expenditures on nuclear weapons include only the staff salaries and weapon systems, among some other costs, but we find it to historically ignore some related but very important activities like waste management, environmental remediation, safeguard measures, as well as public health costs. And as well on the nuclear lobby in the second context. So similar to the revolving door effect that Orion already mentioned, the defense industry has the same issue. So the industry spends around 110 million American dollars lobbying annually since 1998, and they give substantial financial contributions also to policymakers in both houses and both parties to push for every increased funding for more capabilities. And this has quite the potential to worsen trust in institutions even further, as well as aggravate the global arms race that we're currently undergoing. And lastly, there are a lot of risks within the defense industry as well, because it's essentially some large oligopolies which dominate the industry, and there's very little competition when it comes to the contracting process, as it only involves a few big companies and one client, which is the government. We find that this opaque contracting process involving a very small number of insiders make the public even more removed from effective determinants of their tax contributions, while other critical sectors like infrastructure and education remain quite underfunded. So in conclusion, to combat the lack of transparency and the revolving door symptom in these spheres, we provided 7 recommendations in our policy paper. And these include implementing a HR grace period to bar former senior officials from taking up positions in think tanks and defense companies, to calling on governments to conduct cross-departmental nuclear budget audits, and also supporting initiatives to submit detailed and disaggregated data on military expenditures to the UN report in military expenditures. So thank you very much. That will be the end of our presentation, and we're looking forward to hear any questions.
Thank you so much, Orion and Vivian. Thank you for your run through and for highlighting your recommendation. As Vivian just said, we're now taking questions. So just a reminder to please submit these to the Q&A function. We did have one submitted to us beforehand for this group. So I'm going to read that one out first. And this is about the COVID pandemic and the link to military spending. So do you think global health crises like the COVID pandemic helped highlight or shift people's views about nuclear weapons and military spending by their state? Be very interested to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure. I believe it was an event hosted by my organization, actually Unidir, a month or two ago on this, also on global military expenditures. And there were some panelists also from CIPRI who mentioned that in their presentation, in the data that they found, despite the COVID pandemic, the global expenditures on defense and weapons actually are still increasing. So I think this is somewhat, I guess, not super surprising in certain ways, because these pandemics, as well as some further national security related problems, which I guess the concept now in some ways also expands beyond just traditional threats to, for example, climate, as well as other issues, for example, like pandemics. that the perception of these threats also leads to more narratives and more insecurities in certain populations and people, and that then to an extent justifies with the narratives and policies that are pushed by industry and by insiders in these fields also contribute to this increase in spending. That's one way I would conceptualize it.
Great, many thanks, Vivian. Perhaps a second question adding on to your focus, which was in this case the US. Do you think that, or what kind of impact do you think the US military-industrial complex has for nuclear weapons issues internationally? And how do you think dismantling the US military-industrial complex could affect other military-industrial complexes around the world on this issue?
Yeah, sure, I can feel this one. Well, it was a big challenge for us to find a focus regarding choosing the United States as our case study. But then again, it's no secret to anyone that the US military-industrial complex is the biggest one in the world. So I think tackling the US as a case study is the most important one because of the growing influence and the growing reach that the US has on nuclear security matters worldwide. So we have, for example, the existence of the US nuclear security umbrella, which is very pervasive in a way, and it hinders many issues of disarmament throughout the world, not only in the US, not only in the US region, but also basically in Europe with NATO and everywhere else. So I think tackling the US military-industrial complex is basically tackling the Goliath of disarmament issues here in this case. So I hope that answered the question. I don't know if Vivian wants to add anything, but I think that's my thoughts on this.
Vivian, if you don't want to add anything, perhaps a final question from my side as well. And maybe this is a bit more, what came first, but what do you think about nuclear disarmament versus dismantling the military-industrial complex? Do you feel like, one is a prerequisite for the other, or do you feel like one has to come first to allow the other to, take the most effect? This is one to think about, so apologies for that.
Yeah, I think they go hand in hand, but asking which one comes first and which one will allow the other to basically shine, it's a very tough question, because the way it stands today, the influence that the MIC has on nuclear decision making and policy making is so big that unless we can break this, there is no path forward to actually allowing this to happen. So if I had to pick which one has to come first, which one is a precondition for the other to happen, I would say first dismantling the MIC and diminishing the hold and the influence it has on decision making, and basically smashing this revolving door thing and the whole well, Eisenhower called the spiritual influence of the MIC on the US. I think it's a prerequisite for us to move forward in this direction. It is possible to kind of how do you say, to go without this, but I think the process would go much smoother and in a much more natural direction if we dismantle the MIC first and then move forward with disarmament issues.
Great, thank you so much, Orion. And we just received perhaps our final question for this round before we move on to the next group, which is, do you think engagement with the public education and a strong shift in public political opinion around the military-industrial complex could effectively confront and dismantle its hold or the influence of nuclear weapons in the US?
I'll quickly jump on that and welcome Orion to add any aspects as well. I think yes, because one thing that we looked into and that we find to be a very important issue, definitely yes in the US case, but not uniquely to the US case as well, is that there's not a lot of, I think, interest or not enough engagement with the public when it comes to these issues. And we're, of course, very passionate few. And of course, sometimes it's difficult to see that within our groups of young people interested in these issues. But in a wider sense, I think with a strong shift in public opinion, as Orion already demonstrated in the data that we found, with more public opinion shifting towards not having nuclear weapons, this is not yet reflected in policy. And we do believe that more of that could be helpful in, again, having the public just know more about the information that is sometimes out there, as we found, but not known enough. So Orion, would you like to add some aspects?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, in my opinion, these issues of public education and awareness are key for a bottoms-up approach regarding these changes, because I've done some informal research with people that I've met, and especially people outside of the field of nuclear security and international relations. And in public, like basic education, we still have this conception, we still learn in school that nuclear weapons were necessary to end the war. So nuclear weapons were seen as the saving grace of World War II. And this is a misconception that sort of enshrines a sort of positive symbolic perception of nuclear weapons throughout history. And nuclear weapons are basically perceived as something good and something that maintains the peace. And this is a basic tenet that we have to break before we move forward. And raising awareness of these issues and basically telling and instructing everyone on the real effects of nuclear weapons and what they actually did and why the bomb was dropped and so on are necessary factors to rebuild this sort of nuclear knowledge that we have. And it is the foundation for us to move forward regarding not only dismantling the MIC, but also promoting general complete disarmament.
Thank you so much, Orion and Vivian, and thank you also to your working group and for this fantastic paper, and thank you for answering all these great questions. Now I think we'll move on to the next group, which my colleague Declan Penrose will be introducing. So Declan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kim, and thank you to Orion and Vivian for a really, really strong start to this discussion, and to everybody in their working group for contributing an excellent paper. So we're now moving on to the next working group with their report titled the Dual Threat of Nuclear Weapons and Climate Change, the Danger of Inaction. And their working group chairs were Jasmine Aude and Nivedetta. I will just move on to introduce them fully. So Jasmine is the co-founder and COO of Ambit Advisory, a non-governmental organization working on security and development issues across the Middle East with a focus on nuclear security and non-proliferation. Previously, she was the Deputy Managing Director at the Middle East Scientific Institute for Security, an NGO based in Jordan and associated with the World Scientific Society. In this capacity, Jasmine led the design and development programs that addressed chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear risks to security in the region. She's a fellow at the Middle East Next Generation of Arms Control Specialists, a program of the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, as well as a board member of the leadership team for the International Students Young Pugwash. Jasmine received her undergraduate degree from political science from New York University and a master's degree in political economy from King's College London. And Nivedetta is a research fellow at the National University of Singapore's Centre for International Law, where she researches all things nuclear law and policy at the international and regional levels. Her particular area of interest has been the intersections between nuclear and other areas, including climate change and environment, maritime security, she was delighted to co-chair this Policy Cycles working group on nuclear weapons issues and climate change. So with the introductions out the way, I will hand it over to our working group chairs for their presentation.
Thank you very much, Declan. I think I'll get us started here. I just want to say thank you, first of all, for the introduction to BASIC, for the opportunity, and also a huge thank you to our working group members for all of their invaluable contributions into this policy paper. I want to start off by, first of all, acknowledging the remarks that were made by Vincent in his introduction. I really appreciated how it's not a competition between climate change and nuclear weapons. I think if we could boil down our findings into one thing, it would be just that. There is no competition. They are not only equally bad, but they actually bring out the worst in each other. So with that, I'll sort of jump right into our paper, which found that there is, in fact, a mutually reinforcing relationship between nuclear weapons and climate change, and that there also needs to be a concerted effort and action to holistically address this dual threat and to break some of the patterns that are influencing these dynamics. We looked at the relationship specifically between nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence, and climate change in order to demonstrate how the fragility in both the climate and nuclear domains can impact global security, stability, and development, while either heightening existing vulnerabilities or potentially creating new ones altogether. And in doing so, we focus on this relationship in three specific aspects. We looked at how nuclear deterrence can impact climate change, how climate change can act as a threat multiplier, and how nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, and climate change interact. For the purposes of this presentation, we've distilled the outcomes of our research effort into a number of main findings, of which there are 8. The first is that nuclear deterrence posture and the associated possession, testing, and threat of use of nuclear weapons can result in grave effects to the climate. And while this effect is, of course, more apparent in the case of actual testing and use, the possession of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence postures can have more indirect impacts on climate change. Next is that given the massive running costs for global nuclear arsenals and the resources that are currently being used to maintain and increase them, these funds could potentially be diverted into climate-related programs in order to address climate change, assuming, of course, that the requisite political will is there. We also have that nuclear deterrence postures may reduce prospects for global cooperation and collective action against climate change. This is a transboundary issue that affects all states to varying degrees, and combating climate change would require cooperation on a lot of different fronts. And the idea here is that this cooperation could be made more difficult in an environment where there's a doctrine that promises threats and retaliation using nuclear weapons is relied upon by a number of states. The next finding is that the impacts of climate change can increase the risk of nuclear weapons use or acquisition by acting as a threat multiplier that can exacerbate geopolitical tensions or influence states' risk calculations. We found that there is a potential for intensified competition for natural resources and energy as a result of either increasing or diminishing access to resources, which can serve as a key driver of conflict. The next finding is that advances in nuclear technologies, combined with their incentives of reduced costs and timelines for deployment, would need to be coupled with the complementary advances in the regulatory structures and frameworks that govern these technologies in order to mitigate any potential risks of nuclear proliferation. Next is that there are rising latency concerns with the potential risk of diversion of efforts and resources into nuclear weapons programs. And finally, that there needs to be a concerted effort by all stakeholders, nuclear armed states and non-nuclear armed states, in order to address the dual threat of nuclear weapons and climate change. And with that, I will hand over to Nivi.
Thanks, Jasmine. As part of our analysis, we also looked at a few case studies. I'm just going to highlight one of them to give you a sample. This relates to the 5th finding that Jasmine shared on the competition for resources, where a shortage of vital resources necessary for state survival is one of the most challenging effects of climate change and acts as a driver for conflict. Here, we looked at the example of the border region between India, Pakistan, and China, being nuclear-armed states, as an example to illustrate how climate change-fueled resource scarcity could stimulate potential nuclear weapons use. The tensions between the 3 states could be aggravated in different ways. We just highlighted 3. So for instance, India may seek full control of Kashmir in order to dam the tributaries there, divert their waters from Pakistan, thereby cutting Pakistan's access off from one of its most crucial freshwater sources in this river. Second, China's had plans to build several dams to divert the Brahmaputra for exclusive national use, and these plans may come to fruition. Another instance could be the strained relationship between China and Pakistan, as increased water flow from melting glaciers in Pakistan-controlled Kashmir could tempt China to erect dams on this territory to alleviate its own water shortages. As a result of these dynamics, any resource-related disputes could be a potential flashpoint for escalation, leading to the threat of nuclear use to deter annexation and perceived overall overuse of critical resources. Any of these threats could, particularly if accompanied by miscalculation and misinterpretation of signals, have the potential to further the risk of nuclear weapons use. You can find more information as well as details on other case studies in our policy brief. Turning then to our policy recommendations that are intended to inspire action to counter the danger of inaction. I'm just going to highlight a few of the key ones here. So our working group identified recommendations that are addressed to 4 different stakeholder groups: the research community, nuclear armed states, all states, and other stakeholders. We encourage the research community to conduct further research on the interplay between nuclear weapons, deterrence, and climate change, as well as proliferation assessments, considering climate change as a threat multiplier. We encourage nuclear armed states to further climate change goals by increasing cooperation and addressing the diversion of resources, and to further support and advance global initiatives to increase climate resiliency in nuclear armed states with lesser capacity. We encourage all states to pursue and enact mitigation and adaptation policies while ensuring that such efforts do not escalate any risk of conflicts or activate an already ambiguous nuclear weapons posture. We also encourage them to champion doctrines that enshrine collective security in the face of a shared problem, as opposed to narrow national security interests. The promotion, universalization, and adherence to the global non-proliferation and disarmament regime and its associated instruments and frameworks need to be a priority for all states to ensure that the risks posed by nuclear weapons and climate change remain in check. We encourage a multi-stakeholder approach in dealing with advanced and new emerging technologies that address climate change and are as proliferation resistant as possible. Here, we encourage the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, to continue facilitating the adaptation and evolution of its safeguards regime. We also encourage states, technology developers, and industry players to invest further in more proliferation-resistant technologies. Overall, as Jasmine highlighted, a concerted and collective effort is required by all stakeholders to address this dual threat of nuclear weapons and climate change. With that, on behalf of our working group, we thank you for your time, and we hope you read our policy brief and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jasmine and Evie. That was a brilliant presentation from both of you, and some really interesting findings from your working group as a whole. It is an extremely interesting topic with all of the overlinks and overlaps between nuclear weapons and climate change. And I wanted to get the Q&A started myself with a question, and that is, what was the most surprising link between nuclear weapons and climate change that you came across whilst writing this paper? I'll ask that to both of you. Go ahead and feel free to answer.
There are so many, obviously. I'm pondering which one to talk about. But for me, I think one of the most interesting ones is so we kind of we're well aware going into this about the fact that climate change can act as a threat multiplier, and we always talk about access to resources. And this was actually a finding by one of our working group members, and it was just seeing it like articulated. It was just a bit of a surprise to me, which is this point about access to resources, whether it's less access, so there's a competition for existing resources, but also in the instance where we have increasing resources as a result of climate change. So if we have glaciers melting in the Arctic, for example, that results in an abundance of resources, which could then result in an increase in competition. So it's almost, I guess it was something that was a bit obvious, but seeing it articulated, I think so clearly, I would say was the biggest surprise for me. less resources or more resources can both be drivers of conflict.
I think just to add on to what Jasmine said, I think for me, what was most surprising is just the different aspects and nuances of the relationship. It's not just a straight answer. When you ask the question, what is a relationship between them? You find that there's just so many different ways to approach it, and there's so many different ways that they're inextricably linked, whether one leading to another or the other leading to another. So I think for me, that was the most surprising element, is to identify and unpack this relationship, which I don't think we've had the luxury of fully unpacking yet. I think there's still more to unpack, and therefore that's why we're encouraging further research.
Yes, thank you for that answer. It's interesting hearing the phrase inextricably linked coming up with Vincent and Tondi in the call, after the way the phrase is used in African Americans Against the Bomb so often and so clearly, that these issues, there are so many links that when you reveal it, you see just how entangled these issues are. So we have another question that has come in anonymously. So do you think that a better understanding of the risks of climate change to nuclear weapons, such as nuclear weapons bases, etc., could encourage states to opt for disarmament-oriented policies?
So, I mean, this is actually one of the points that we alluded to in our paper, which is that we have one of the issues we think that we have when considering the dynamics between climate change and nuclear weapons is that, to a very large degree, they both do operate in these very specific silos. I think in recent years, there has been an increasing trend of kind of putting nuclear weapons into the broader humanitarian and development domain and developmental domain, into seeing how nuclear weapons can potentially impact this. We obviously, I think the most prominent example of this is the humanitarian initiative of ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, that tries to firmly put nuclear weapons into outside of like this hard security sphere, and to look at all the social, environmental, and other humanitarian impacts that nuclear weapons can have. So it wasn't elevated as a pure policy recommendation, but one of the areas that we think probably deserves further interest is to look specifically at activism that we see, whether it's sort of at the grassroots level or top-down activism. We have that, I think it's becoming very prominent in the climate domain. And we've had it for years, decades in the nuclear weapons domain, as far as calls for disarmament are concerned. But we're not seeing a lot of cross-fertilization between these two communities. So we think that this potentially could be an avenue to look at that would bring these two closer together, with the view that it would possibly support making progress in both of these domains.
And then, Nivi, do you have anything to add to that? That was a great answer, Jasmine, by the way.
I just want to acknowledge a presentation that the EVN network did as part of our expert masterclasses, which is a presentation by Jamie Kwong, and I think she is present in the audience today. She also deals with this issue, and she has also looked at nuclear weapons bases in the US and the impact of climate change. So I will also encourage you to read her paper. That's just my little plug there.
No, thank you for having that, Nivi. And yes, that was an excellent presentation by Jamie Kwong. And yes, the paper presented has recently been released as well, which is yeah, congratulations to Jamie for that. It's an excellent piece of work, and it was a really good masterclass. So as we have, yeah, I think it is about spot on time for us to move on to the next panel. So thank you so much to Nivi and Jasmine. That was an excellent panel and great answers to the questions. So we will now move on to the next panel, which is titled Beyond the Echo Chamber, sorry, creating a more equitable, diverse and inclusive nuclear weapons policy field. And this is to be presented by Ian Fleming-Zhu and Sinaya Nair. So Sinaya Nair is a research analyst with the Nuclear Security Program and Partnerships in Nuclear Proliferation Prevention Program at the Stimson Center, and coordinator for the International Nuclear Security Forum. Her work focuses on CBRN, security and non-proliferation, insider threats, disinformation, emerging technologies, and domestic violent extremist threats to national security and critical infrastructure. Prior to joining the Stimson Center, Sanaya worked on the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization in Vienna as part of the External Regulations, Protocol, and International Cooperation section. She has also worked for the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in The Hague, supporting public affairs and external relations activities. Sanaya holds an MA in Geography and International Relations from the University of St. Andrews in the United Kingdom. I'm moving on to Ian. So Ian is currently a PhD candidate in International Relations at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. His areas of specialization are nuclear diplomacy, nuclear non-proliferation, arms control and disarmament. Having previously served as CBTO, a CNESS research fellow, Ian possesses a deep understanding of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization's missions and activities. He recently selected to be part of the Arms Control Negotiations Academy for 2023 to 24 research fellowship cohort. As a fellow within FRS's Ballistic Missile Non-Proliferation Youth Group, Ian is actively engaged in addressing the challenges associated with ballistic missile proliferation and striving to strengthen international efforts in non-proliferation and disarmament. With a passion for promoting nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, Ian is committed to making significant contributions to the field through research, policy analysis, and participation in relevant initiatives. So with the introductions out of the way, I'm happy to pass over to our working group chairs.
Thank you, Declan, for the introductions. I am delighted to present to you on the topic of Beyond the Echo Chamber, creating a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive nuclear weapons policy field. In the next few minutes, we will explore the exclusions and exploitations that have been prevalent in the field of nuclear weapons policy and discuss the need for sustainable efforts to promote equity, diversity, and inclusion. To address this imbalance of power, policies that aim to combat homogeneity, unfair treatment, and exclusionary practices require sustainable and targeted efforts to make the field more equitable, diverse, and inclusive. Let's dive in.
So to begin, it's important for us to talk about why equity, diversity, and inclusion matters for the nuclear field. As Ian mentioned, nuclear field has been defined by inequity and exclusivity since its inception. EDI policies address this imbalance of power, and these initiatives will not only improve the workforce, but composition and outcomes of organizations that implement them, but also ensure that the decisions made by those in power are considerate of all the stakeholders impacted by the nuclear weapons field. EDI matters for the nuclear field for three key reasons. First, increasing EDI offers unique perspective from different backgrounds and cultures, ensuring a comprehensive approach to the challenges addressed by the nuclear weapons policy field. Second, EDI offers a holistic approach to harm reduction with diverse teams promoting innovation, performance, talent, and diversity of views, thus improving outcomes and increasing profitability, making the policy field more adaptable and efficient. Third, EDI enhances legitimacy and trust by promoting collaboration in the development of relationships between stakeholders, enhancing positive outcomes for the field overall.
We identified 4 key groups that have been victims of exclusion and exploitation in the nuclear policy field. The first group were indigenous communities. Since the earliest days of the Manhattan Project, indigenous communities have inequitably bore the effects of nuclear weapons development, production, and testing. Their voices are often excluded from decision-making processes and lack adequate representation in shaping nuclear weapons policies. The second group we identified were women. Nuclear weapons policy have been characterized by gender biases, including the use of gendered languages and expectations that limit women's participation and contributions. Merely increasing the number of women in the field without addressing underlying systemic barriers does not lead to genuine inclusivity and meaningful change. The third group that we identified were non-Western voices. The lack of participation and representation from people from the global South is due to systemic issues and structural barriers due to biased hiring practices and unconscious preferences for candidates in the global north. Thus, non-Western voices are often underrepresented in international organizations and lack equal opportunities for professional development and advancement. And last but not least, the LGBTQ+ communities. LGBTQ+ activists, anti-militarist beliefs hinder their engagement in the nuclear weapons policy field. Heteronormativity and sexism in these spaces discourages LGBTQ+ individuals, limiting their involvement. Fear of discrimination prevents open identification and full contributions. Inclusivity challenges result in a lack of diverse LGBTQ+ talent.
Ian spoke about the legacy of exclusion and exploitation in the nuclear field, and the fact that these groups in particular have been excluded. And in our report and recommendations, we focus on bias as the root cause of homogeneous workforce composition, unfair participation, and the exclusion of these demographics from the nuclear weapons policy field. Homogeneity or lack of diversity in the field has consequences for nuclear policy. The lack of EDI in the nuclear weapons policy-making community has perpetuated thinking that promotes nuclear arms races, discourages critical reflection, and disincentivizes disarmament, making the field immune to change despite the shifting security environment. Homogeneity also runs the risk of systemic fallacies, with findings from psychology and behavioral science showing that teams without EDI are more prone to making mistakes due to counterproductive group dynamics, which penalize new or divergent views. The lack of EDI has also resulted in ill-informed nuclear policy that is innovation resistant and poorly suited for reducing the risk and harm associated with nuclear weapons. Equity, diversity, and inclusion are crucial for nuclear weapons policy field to improve outcomes and must be taken on board by decision makers.
Building upon SNARE's insights on the consequences of homogeneity in the nuclear weapons field, our working group recognizes the urgent need for active efforts to include marginalized communities. We propose these recommendations. Firstly, countering gender roles require long-term strategies to address structural barriers. Initiatives must take childcare responsibilities, break gender stereotypes, and foster an inclusive and supportive work environment for all genders. Secondly, promoting inclusive language in nuclear weapons treaties and policy discourse is crucial. Gendered language marginalizes women's participation and perpetuates imbalances. By adopting inclusive terminology, we ensure equal representation and engagement of all individuals in shaping nuclear policies. Lastly, equitable hiring practices are crucial. Limited career options deter marginalized communities in the global south from participating. Policymakers and NGOs should create targeted initiatives to promote and include these communities, ensuring equal opportunities for engagement in the policy field.
The next set of recommendations focus on addressing systemic EDI issues through change in organizational culture and attitudes towards EDI. EDI efforts need to be sustainable and targeted to address the unique needs of an organization or group of stakeholders in order to combat homogeneity, unfair treatment, and exclusionary practices. Organizations also need to implement collective team-based bias assessments and learning activities, which can improve performance and morale, making for a more efficient and effective policy field overall. Activities that change cognitive rules to destigmatize resistance and allow space for unlearning and change can more effectively shift individual attitudes and organizational culture. Finally, diversity begets diversity. Performative EDI and tokenism are not efficient means of creating organizational change. Leaders must create conditions that sustainably increase EDI's positive effects on behavior and collaboration, which means reducing stereotyping and conflict to improve outcomes. Diverse candidates should be actively recruited, retained, and offered opportunities for advancement at nuclear policy organizations.
Engaging a diverse range of stakeholders is crucial for the implementation of these recommendations. Policy and decision makers, organizations, and individuals all play an important role. By collectively engaging these stakeholders, we can create a more inclusive and equitable nuclear weapons policy field. Together, we can build a future where diversity, equity, and inclusion are at the core of nuclear weapons policy, fostering innovative solutions and a more just world. Let us be the catalysts for change and build a world that is free from the exclusion and exploitation that exists within the nuclear weapons policy field. Thank you very much for allowing us to present our topic.
Thank you, Ian and Sanaya. Again, another excellent presentation and a really strong and clear set of recommendations to move forwards with. So thank you very much. So we already have a question live submitted through the Q&A. And the question is, do you think stronger efforts at DEI could have an impact on the kinds of nuclear weapons policies we see made and prioritized by states nationally and internationally?
I don't mind taking a start at the question, and Ian, if you want to jump in at any point, please go ahead. I think that is one of the things that we focused on with our working group. We wanted to talk about how nuclear weapons policy might look different if you incorporate people who have been historically marginalized, and in particular people who have been specifically affected by nuclear weapons testing, production, and use in the past. We think that if you incorporate these kinds of perspectives, you're more likely to create nuclear weapons policy that is at least more considerate of the humanitarian impacts. And regardless of whether you are a deterrence advocate or a disarmament advocate, placing humans at the center of it creates for more effective security and non-proliferation policy overall. And we hope that people are able to read our report and encourage debate on these kinds of issues, because we think that incorporating these perspectives will change outcomes pretty significantly.
Ian, do you have anything to add to that question?
No, I think I'm satisfied with how Snea answered. I think she said covered all bases.
Yeah.
I think we'd very much also like to acknowledge the fact that the only reason we're able to answer any of these questions well is because we had an excellent group of folks who worked with us to write this paper, and they deserve all the credit in the world for helping us come up with some really excellent recommendations that we think should be absolutely taken into consideration.
That's great. Yes, everybody put in such important work. So we have one more question we actually had sent beforehand, as we called for some early questions on Twitter yesterday, and we've had this one in. How do you think we can best tackle the problem of insincerity when working on mainstreaming diversity, equity, and inclusion in the field and its workplaces? So many individuals might complete any necessary training and talk the talk, but not really walk the walk when it comes to putting it into action. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that question?
I'm assuming that we are referring to organizations, is that correct?
I believe so, yes. Yes.
Okay, I think, all right, thank you. I think it's a matter of holding organizations, policymakers, and decision makers accountable, because I think the time for tokenism and just saying for the sake of saying it's over, we need action. And it's up to us when we advocate for these policy papers to make sure that they are actually implemented, and we want action. So while words are all fancy, we need actions to follow up on those words as well, by holding these organizations accountable.
I think Ian phrased it beautifully. And the only thing that I would add to his remarks is that one of the things we also focused on in terms of the recommendations we produced and the context that we provided for why EDI matters for the nuclear weapons policy field is helping nuclear weapons policy organizations understand why equity, diversity, and inclusion help improve their organizational outcomes. At the end of the day, we I think all in this event agree that these are principles that should be incorporated just on their own merit for basic humanitarian reasons in order to treat each other like equals and engage in a world that is considerate of one another. But at the end of the day, organizations are not necessarily known for doing that without more reason behind it. So we wanted to make almost a business case for why organizations should be incorporating these things. And we think that it improves outcomes, it can help strengthen security, and it can help make for better policy. And we think that if we find ways of communicating to organizations how increasing EDI is going to improve those things, we're going to see much more effective incorporation that's much more meaningful and less performative.
Yeah, that's again, another really strong set of answers from you both. And yeah, thank you very much, Ian and Snea. That was a excellent Q&A session after the presentation. It is now time for us to move on to the next panel. So thank you very much for your contribution to this and to your working group for your paper. So now we are moving on to the next part of the report, which was titled "The Ultimate Colonizer: Challenging Racism and White Supremacy in Nuclear Weapons Policymaking." And the working group chairs will be presenting are Mari Fines and Halima Saida. So just to introduce them now, Mari Fines is a nuclear disarmament advocate with extensive experience in the oversight of movement building strategies, navigating the intersection of nuclear disarmament and social justice through tactics including grassroots organizing, policy engagement, and coalition building. So Fines' foundation in nuclear intersectionality, conflict resolution, transitional justice, and racial disparities in the US and African diaspora. She currently serves on the steering committee for Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, so WCAP's DEI initiative organizations in solidarity. She is also a member of Foreign Policy for Americas, Next Gen Initiative, and a co-lead for the DEI working group, a Center for Strategic and International Studies, AILA International Fellow, and a member of the Center for Strategic and International Studies and Diversity in National Security 2022 US National Security and a Foreign Affairs Leadership List. So Halima is a doctoral candidate at the National University of Science and Technology in Pakistan, where she is focusing on Pakistan's nuclear discourse and identity construction. She is currently a South Asia Visiting Fellow at the Stimson Center and a Research Fellow at the Rhodes Initiative in Pakistan. She has worked at Pakistan's Strategic Plans Division, where she conducted arms control policy and analysis. And with the introductions out of the way, I'll now pass on to the working group chairs for their presentation.
Thank you so much, Declan. I don't think I ever get people reading bios, and so it is always interesting to see what I've written about myself on paper. It feels incredibly poignant for us to go after the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Working Group, because I feel like our work is so coupled as we step into our presentation. Before I get started, Halima and I both want to acknowledge our working group and all the hard work that they did throughout this process. There would be no paper, there would be no moment if they did not spend all this time. That being said, as you know, the nuclear weapons have played a significant role in the Western and global security structure since 1945. Their origins can be traced back to colonial notions of power, strategic competition, and a desire for global dominance. Today, we're witnessing the manifestation of these neo-colonial and racist ideologies in non-proliferation policies against the alleged threat of non-Western proliferation. In our policy paper, we set out to explore these challenges we posed by racism and white supremacy in nuclear policymaking. By acknowledging the historical and the ongoing injustices faced by marginalized communities, what we strive to do was foster an understanding, advocate for change, and pave the way for a future where nuclear weapons policies are rooted in inclusivity, justice, and global cooperation, with the achieved goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. We really believe that through this paper, we can all build a war that transcends the destructive legacy of the nuclear weapons complex and the bomb, and that works towards a more equitable, just, and peaceful future.
So I'll move forward with the key arguments that we discussed in our working group. And the marginalized communities, including Black, Brown, Indigenous, and people of color, have been disproportionately affected by the negative impacts of the global nuclear weapon system. Apologies. So this is a multifaceted system that encompasses not only the physical infrastructure of nuclear weapons development, production, testing, and deployment, but also the underlying power dynamics, ideologies, and historical legacies that shape and sustain it. This implies that the historical context in which nuclear weapons emerged is rooted in colonial understandings of power and dominance, by the Western nations. This also notes that these structures of colonial understanding and systemic oppression are not upheld simply by Western nations, but by any nation, including those in the global South who ascribe to these systems of thinking. From testing and mining to potential use, people of color have borne the brunt of its consequences. And it is quite evident that these dangerous and harmful legacies of the past cannot be ignored any longer. Now, it is imperative that in order to continue to push the processes that decolonize the nuclear weapons policymaking, we seek ways to dismantle these systems and work towards a more equitable and just world that goes beyond the destructive power of nuclear weapons. Some of the key points that our group discussed, and we have discussed it at length in our policy paper. For example, the non-proliferation regime, it depoliticizes the problem of nuclear proliferation as a neutral endeavor to reduce nuclear risk globally. And it is kind of distinct from larger questions of global power and serves the political interests of largely the Western states. The non-proliferation regime does not adequately address the underlying political, economic, and security dynamics that drive nuclear proliferation. There is also often a selective enforcement of non-proliferation norms. Also, the non-proliferation regime is sustained by financial incentives and creative techniques to uphold the legitimacy of nuclear weapons. The extensive nuclear testing during the Cold War had the same profound impacts on global and marginalized communities as a nuclear war. And despite no nuclear exchange between the nuclear weapon states, it was the non-nuclear weapon states which suffered the consequences of radioactive fallout by experiencing early mortality, disease, displacement, and contamination of food sources and ecosystems. Nuclear non-proliferation discourse has largely been shaped by the West, and colonial thought patterns are quite visible in this discourse. The arguments that were used to justify the position of nuclear weapons by a few haves discredited the acquisition and possession of nuclear weapons by the haves not. In context of nuclear aspiring countries in the third world, this imperial binärism created an other which was technologically backward, had inferior management practices, and deficient safety standards, and could not master the complex nuclear technology. Now I'll ask Mari to talk about the recommendations that we discussed in our paper. Mari?
Thanks, Halima. So we had a few key recommendations throughout our paper, but our overall recommendation was that in order for nuclear weapons complex to provide an equitable policy structure for all states, we must do the work to decolonize the current power structures in the complex. This includes working towards a new security structure that recognizes the rising role of non-Western states in geopolitics and pushes towards more equitable solutions. It encourages current and emerging leaders to think critically about the policies in place, analyzing their efficacy, and thinking about past colonial and racialist understandings among states across the globe. This also requires that non-Western states are provided agency and the ability to advocate for themselves, displaying their own value and their reasons to be included in the new geopolitical security conversation. There must also be an increased representation and participation of non-Western countries in the international nuclear policy forums, both at a state and a civil society level. This includes more seats at the table for non-Western countries and governing bodies in forums, organizations, and conferences. And overall, just a greater emphasis on the aspects of communities have in common, including the indiscriminate impacts of the current policies. That being said, here are a few tact recommendations that we hope folks will take away. For there to be a just solution to the previous implications of the nuclear policymaking, we must seek to acknowledge the fragility of the current geopolitical structure. Leaders must seek to acknowledge and work towards remediation, compensation, legal and fiscal action against actors who have caused harm or neglect in the nuclear industry, as well as advocate for policies that prioritize public safety, environmental protection, and disarmament. We must seek to promote decolonized frameworks that centralize justice and disarmament to achieve progress towards equity. We need to establish a conference resolution framework to ensure that there is accountability for nuclear justice, encompassing liability, reparations, truth-telling, and other institutional reforms that prevent future nuclear harm. Finally, as we just heard about, very similar to the EDI group, we have to promote inclusivity and diverse representation by amplifying and mainstreaming underrepresented voices in nuclear policy discussions, moving beyond the tokenistic understandings and recognitions, and ensuring that we genuinely have inclusive opportunities for non-white and diverse perspectives. So finally, I'm going to toss it back to Halima for our final conclusion.
Thank you, Mari. So there's much to be done to address the generationally negative harms caused by racism and white supremacy in nuclear weapons policy making. Rather than hiding from our past, we must just begin. The first step in this process is to provide agency to those impacted by the harms of nuclear weapons complex, learning what redress and remediation looks like to them, and then working to create just fiscal, ecological, emotional, and legal reparations to create a more just security structure. We must then decolonize our systems and structures, work towards disarmament, and create a global security framework rooted in human-centered security, equity, and justice. And if you're going to be, to be a world that is transparent about states' national security and global foreign policy, we must address and work for a world that is more equitable and just for all. Thank you so much for your time and patient listening.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mari and Halima, for yet another brilliant presentation. And again, to the rest of your working group as well for all of the hard work. So I'll jump straight into the Q&A as we already have two questions in the chat. So Maria McLafferty has asked, what do you believe is fundamental to dismantling racism and white supremacy in nuclear weapons policy structures? Is there one specific policy, practice, or goal that you would prioritize?
I can take a first crack, Halima, if you want to chime in after. I think the difficult thing about asking if there is one singular thing to do to decolonize is that we are talking about a living and breathing system. There is not a single structure within the nuclear weapons complex that has not been impacted by colonization and racialist understandings as it pertains to the nuclear weapons complex. That's really how we got to a place when I was talking about those recommendations, where it was a multifaceted approach about what we needed to do to decolonize. Because what you need to do is, it's not only the people, it is the system. So we're talking about looking at reparations from a legal standpoint, from a fiscal standpoint, but then we're also talking about the people that we're putting in power and the ideologies that they're espousing when they're creating these policies. I think in order for us to truly decolonize a space, we have to first decolonize a framework, and that would be where I would start. And that would be just engaging on an academic and an ideological level about what does that look like to really think through a new understanding that doesn't include these white supremacist or racialized existences in the framework.
Yeah, fully endorse Mari's answer to this. And also, I just want to add two quick points to it. One, the note that I ended on, giving agency to the people who have been the worst effectees of nuclear weapons policy making in context of racism and white supremacy. One that is, giving that agency is really, really important. The other is centering justice in policy making. And then within that whole idea of centering justice, it begins with accountability. And it may or may not involve criminal liability, but it definitely involves taking responsibility for those actions. It involves reparations, it involves truth telling. It also involves institutional reform. So it's not just one straightforward answer. We absolutely realize what we are talking about is much, it's much easier to state these things. It is very difficult to accomplish, to practically do these things. We absolutely acknowledge that. But so we can't really pinpoint just one specific, recommendation that, if you do this, you'll be on the right path to decolonizing, these systems, and also to addressing the racism in the nuclear weapons policy making. So it's a whole set of recommendations. It's a whole set of measures that need to be taken, that need to be implemented for us to see, a world that eventually would be free of nuclear weapons, and eventually would be, at least our hope is, more equitable and just for all.
I think on a final point, I want to be clear that when we're saying decolonizing, it is not exclusive to Western nations or Western folks. Decolonizing is also a framework that Black, Brown, and marginalized people need to do if they are upholding a system that supports ideologies of white supremacy and racism. And so really, to do that, it is an entire manifestation of everybody working through that thought, everybody working through those systems, and that is the only time we can move this forward.
Yeah, thank you both for a great answer. I think it again kind of shows the importance of the phrase inextricably linked is runs throughout this field. So I'm just conscious of time. We have one more question left for this panel. So I'll just ask this and then we will move on to the next panel. So what do you see, if any, as the difference between challenging versus dismantling racism and white supremacy in nuclear weapons policy making?
I think of it as, people have often heard me say, the difference between an ally and an accomplice. I don't like allies because allies can pull out of treaties. You don't really have to get stuck in the work. You can decide when you want to or when you don't want to engage. Accomplices are forced to do the work along with you. That is what I think about when I think about the difference between challenging and dismantling. You can challenge all you want. You can talk about it. You can say you're about it. You can tokenize over it. Thinking about dismantling is thinking about what are these steps and taking these steps to change a system, to create a new framework. And that nuance, that very subtle change, is the difference between talking about the work and actually doing it.
I love this analogy, allies and accomplices. And, I'll just add on one thing too, is that if, let's say, you're talking about baby steps in this whole scenario, talk about challenging racism and white supremacy. If you're talking about actually walking the walk, talk about dismantling.
100%.
Yeah, that was a fantastic answer and analogy. I never heard that before. It ties well in to some of Vincent's opening comments as well, about the difference between kind of revolution and reform. So thank you, Halima and Mari, for that, and for your working group for all the hard work on the report. So now this panel is finished, and I'm now handing back over chairing the panel, to Kim, who will take over for the next panel. So yes, thank you again, everyone, and I'll hand over to Kim.
Thanks so much, Declan. No, that was really great hearing from the previous three groups, and really interesting discussions and conversations there. So last but not least, we'll hear from our final group. Those will be presented by one of the co-chairs, who's Guy Blaise-Fougas, and one of the working group members, who's Ksenia Ternavskaya, who will be presenting the paper of their working group on the intersection of social justice, uranium mining, and nuclear testing. To briefly introduce the two, Guy is the national of Cameroon. He is the teacher, writer, and peace activist. His role is to educate youth for peace and nonviolence, and especially including young girls and women, at the heart of crisis resolution and awareness raising on several issues in their communities. He joined the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in 2014 and founded the Cameroon chapter of World Beyond War in 2020, where he's currently acting as chapter coordinator. Now, Ksenia is a research consultant for Open Nuclear Network, a program of One Earth Future. Prior to working with ONN, she interned at the CTBTO, the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, the PR Center, and the Korea Policy Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Ksenia holds a BA in International Scientific and Technological Cooperation from National Research Nuclear University in Russia, and an MSc in Science and Technology Policy from KIST in South Korea. So thank you both for joining us today, and we're really looking forward to hearing your key takeaways and recommendations that you have on the intersection of social justice, uranium mining, and nuclear testing.
Thank you, Kim, for giving me the floor. Greeting to everyone on the call. I will first apologize because I will put off my camera. I have serious internet challenges. So to give myself the chance to communicate, I will better put the camera off. Sorry for that. So I'll present with the paper we work on with the other group members during the past month. And the group decided that our policy paper will reflect a broad approach to social justice in the nuclear context. Especially, we explored the interplay of different forms of harm via 2 case studies, one focusing on uranium mining in the Navajo Nation and the other on nuclear testing in the Pacific region. So the paper seeks to elucidate the impact of the production and testing of nuclear weapons on individuals, families, communities, and nations. It outlines a conceptual framework for the analysis of social justice in the context of nuclear politics, a general discussion of social justice in relation to the case studies. So in examining the intersection of social justice and nuclear weapons, so we considered social justice as referring to the general notion of moral rectitude as well as the particular realm of authoritative rules and reciprocal rights and obligations and assumptions justifying the assumption justifying colonialism and by extension the exploitation of indigenous land for the production and testing of nuclear weapons. So in this paper, we consider social policies and other right-based initiatives that protect vulnerable and disadvantaged groups of national or global society from oppression, discrimination, exclusion, or that support them materially. So in the context of nuclear weapons, the foregoing exploitation of social justice suggests that it is imperative for a disadvantaged community to play a leading role in discussions about social justice because the benefits and burdens of these weapons have been distributed unequally, which inequality has adversely affected indigenous people and minorities in particular. So uranium mining has some potential benefits, including providing a reliable source of energy and reducing greenhouse gas emission. However, it is also closely tied to the weapon industry, what we are focusing on. In various African countries, uranium mining companies are accused of human rights violations, environmental degradation, racial injustice, and exploitation of local population. The social justice concerns surrounding uranium mining stem from the fact that the negative impacts are often borne by indigenous communities who historically have been unfairly targeted for the siting of hazardous waste facilities and other polluting industry. So looking at the Navajo Nation in the United States, it's worth noting that the uranium mining industry began in the 1940s and continues until the 1980s. About 30 million tons of uranium ore were extracted. Within the United States, approximately 66% of the non-uranium deposits are on reservation land, as much as 80% are on treaty guaranteed land, and up to 19% of uranium mining occur on adjacent Native American land. The mining operations primarily run by non-native companies resulted in contamination of the air, soils, and water, endangering the health of the Navajo communities. Uranium mining being the most environmentally problematic of any mining activity in the region. The miners themselves were not always adequately protected from the harmful effects of radiation exposure, leading to high rates of illness and death from lung cancer, kidney disease, and other ailments. So in addition to the health impacts, the mining industry led to social injustices for the Navajo people. Many Navajo lands, which were promised to them in treaties with the US government, were taken over for mining without their consent or adequate compensation. So this disruption of traditional ways of life and loss of access to land greatly affected the cultures of this community. So this Navajo Nation is the prime illustration of the fact that uranium mining affects indigenous communities' land and health. So given these active concerns about water contamination, even today, about 15% of the population residing in the Navajo Nation lacks access to running water, with residents often forced to seek unregulated water sources, which remain susceptible to bacteria, fecal matter, and uranium contamination. So on the discussion about the nuclear testing and social justice, know that nuclear tests have been conducted by the United States, United Kingdom, and France particularly, and have affected communities in an indigenous land in the Marshall Islands, French Polynesia, Kiribati, and Australia. In the Pacific region, many indigenous populations have been disproportionately affected by these tests. Due to nuclear test programs, communities have been forced to relocate and face displacement. Their land and sea were contaminated, and severe health issues resulted from radioactive contamination. To give one of examples of the background information on these tests, one example is the Marshall Islands, having a history of being under colonial rule or imperial influence between the 16th and 20th centuries. Between 1946 and 1958, when the Marshall Islands were a trust territory under the US administrative control, the US conducted 67 nuclear tests there. Radiation exposure resulting from nuclear tests of a total explosive power of 108.5 megatons has been traced all over the Marshall Islands. About the French Polynesia, between 1960 and 1966, France conducted its nuclear test in Algeria. However, due to Algeria gaining independence, the French nuclear testing program had to be moved elsewhere. And the colonial choice fell on French Polynesia, which at that time was French overseas territories. So consequently, from 1966 to 1974, France conducted 193 nuclear tests, 41 of which were atmospheric. Initially, the French government claimed that nuclear tests caused no harm to indigenous population and only later recognized some damage. So nuclear testing has been a part of an interconnected cycle of nuclear injustice. Nuclear testing sites have been intentionally situated away from the political and economic centers of nuclear armed states. Hence, nuclear tests have been conducted on colonized and occupied land for indigenous and racialized people, leading to their displacement and contamination of their land. Therefore, social injustices engendered by nuclear testing are embedded in colonial and imperial global hierarchies and power structures. The framework of nuclear testing as social justice issue is hereby understood as an overarching framework, including and uniting overlapping and interrelated manifestations of injustice such as environmental, racial, gendered, generational, reproductive, informational, and other forms of injustice. So based on the analysis we did, the paper presents a set of policy recommendations to reckon with past injustices and remedy those that persist. So I will give the floor to Ksenia to present the key recommendations that we came to find after our analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy, for giving me the floor and being aware of the timing. I'll try to be very quick. So we have outlined 4 major directions of the policy recommendations. And the first one is that it is important to center affected communities' perspectives in nuclear policymaking generally. So increasing representation of affected communities in nuclear policymaking by, for example, inviting survivor-led civil society organizations and networks or survivors themselves to engage in various platforms with diplomats, with policymakers, with government officials can be very beneficial. And these platforms could be NPT Review Cycle or the Conference on Disarmament or any other forum that you can imagine in our field. Nuclear weapons also should be recognized as a issue that is closely intertwined with social justice, climate change, indigenous rights for self-determination, and these connections should be verbally and textually addressed and considered in the nuclear policy making process and for us. The second direction is acknowledgement and apologies for harm caused. So first, publicly apologizing and acknowledging the harm caused by nuclear weapons in international forums is pivotal. The declassifying relevant documents to estimate the extent of harm and identify groups in need for remediation is also seems to be very important, especially considering that a lot of information is still remains classified. And also strengthening the discussion on humanitarian impacts on the high level platforms is crucial. The third one is going from retribution compensation towards reparations. In this particular context, conducting comprehensive research and finance projects to recover areas affected by mining and nuclear testing activities seems to be very important. Then the next one is advocate for increased financial compensation for communities affected by nuclear testing and mining, and mainstreaming the issues in relevant research areas. And last but not the least, ensuring greater accountability and transparency from governments and corporations involved in nuclear industries to address damage and assess the reparations that are needed. And the fourth and the last direction of recommendations is using and strengthening existing tools, because surprisingly, we do have them. We just need to strengthen those and make them more visible and make them more functional within the nuclear policy field. The first is recommendation is to utilize the international monitoring system of the CTBTO to measure radiological contamination and monitor anomalies related to environmental damage in the areas where the mining and testing were conducted. Considering international instruments like TPNW and specifically the Vienna Action Plan from 2022 as benchmarks for global victim assistance, because in the other documents, the victim assistance haven't really been addressed, and these are really the first big international legislation that addresses victim assistance, and that's very important. And the last is recognizing nuclear industrial complex injustices as a crime against humanity in order to streamline the pursuit of justice and address survivors' needs more efficiently, because without such a definition, it is nearly impossible to address the social justice issues intertwined with nuclear weapons in any of the international courts, really. So these are our recommendations. Thank you for your attention. We will be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Ksenia and Guy. I think as we're kind of running short of time, we'll just take perhaps another question in the chat or in the Q&A function, which is, what do you think are some of the greatest barriers in trying to bring about social justice for those who have suffered due to nuclear testing? If you could perhaps give just a brief notes on that, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Sure, I can start, and Guy, you can jump in whenever you would like. I think the biggest challenge and the biggest barriers is the fact that social justice issues are not really taken seriously in nuclear weapons fora and nuclear policy fora. And I think there is so much work to be done, research to be done, and policy making to be done for these issues to be taken seriously at first, and then we can start solving the problem. For now, we need to recognize that the problem exists, and this is very crucial for our field. Yeah. So, Guy, do you have anything to add to that?
Thanks, Senya. Just to add one more, the issue in this policy framework is that the policy are often making without inclusion of the affected communities. So which makes it difficult to respond to their needs. So and the nuclear armed states often don't fulfill their commitment when it comes to implement the policies the treaties that exist. So these are some of the two barriers that I could add here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Guy. And thank you to both. I'm really sorry. I think in this case, we won't have any more time for any more questions, as I do recognize we're short on time. And I do want to wrap this up and just give some thanks. So first of all, thank you two for giving an overview of your paper and your recommendations and highlighting the biggest issues that you encountered when researching social justice in connection to nuclear weapons. Yeah, I would just like to thank, first of all, everyone that joined us today for the fantastic questions that have been asked, to the working group chairs and all those present here today that were presenting for answering those questions. A special thanks also to Vincent Itondi for joining us and for giving such a fantastic keynote speech that I thought just did so much to kick off this whole discussion today. Also, thank you to all of the authors, all of the contributors, and all of the working groups, those that were perhaps involved in the beginning but had to drop out for whatever reason, those that were in the background that are perhaps not necessarily mentioned even on the papers. I think everyone has contributed so much to making this policy cycle a success. So I just really wanted to say thank you to all of you. We will add the link again to the report in the chat. Do also check out the report on the website. We always keep our website up to date. So if there's anything in terms of events or in terms of reports that we publish that you would like to learn more about, you can definitely find it on the basic website. Do have a look at them, and we hope you do read some of those great policy papers that the groups have put together. If you missed any part of the conversation today, we will also add the recording to our website. As usual, that will probably happen over the next week or two, so you can follow up and look up anything that you might have missed. Also, if you're an early career researcher or young professional in the field and you would like to become more involved in some of our future activities, we're excited to announce that we will be opening up our next call for applications to join the EVN later in August. So do please, again, check out our website, our social media if you're interested. We'd love to hear from you. And for those that are here today that can think of anyone else who might want to join, please do share that. We'll be putting out more details on that soon, so stay tuned for that. And yeah, we hope to see you again soon. For now, thank you so much for joining and have a fantastic rest of the day. See you soon.